Major funding for this program is provided by Grace Bairstead Foundation, Bolthouse Foundation, James and Judith DeVries Foundation, Stewart Family Foundation, R. Hale Family Foundation, ServiceMaster Foundation, Samuel E. and Mary W. Thatcher Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Rick and Linda Dicker, Jay and Laura Krause, Virginia Krause, Elizabeth Irby Foundation, Karen C. Wright, and Dr. John Templeton, Jr.
I was at this time living, like so many atheists, in a whirl of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. C.S. Lewis, from his autobiography, Surprised by Joy.
On November 22nd, 1963, American President John F. Kennedy was killed by a sniper's bullet in Dallas, Texas. Thousands of miles to the east, the Beatles released their second album in London, a soon-to-be classic called With the Beatles. And in the cloistered, scholarly world of Oxford, England, the long career of Clive Staples Lewis ended with his death. He was 64 years old. C.S. Lewis's career was defined by scholarly pursuits in medieval literature, Christian apologetic writings, and an imagination that brought magic into the lives of children and adults through a book series called The Chronicles of Narnia. To many of his readers, the magic of C.S. Lewis's writings will never end.
C.S. Lewis was an Oxford scholar. First and foremost, I would say, he was a great teacher.
First and foremost, he was a Christian. Secondly, he was a scholar.
Lewis, I think, had those two gifts in great abundance each. He had profound things to say, and he said them well.
He was a fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford. He was an Oxford graduate himself. He held 2 degrees from Oxford. He spent his life in the academic world, doing lectures and holding tutorials.
He was a great writer, great literary critic, literary historian, great writer of children's fantasy literature.
I think it is no disservice to him to say that he is not one of the great novelists of the 20th century. I think he would have been the first person to say that himself.
He had the face looking like a pork chop butcher, I think. Somebody said he was very butcher-like and very hearty and very loud and very ready to put his foot down and order people around.
He was a very humorous man, a great wit, great fun to be with. The conversation with Jack was mostly laughter.
And he made the statement that the things that he asserts most rigorously and vigorously are the things that he resisted long and accepted late. And he basically brought all of his understanding, his argumentative skills, his fast learning to bear on the defense of the Christian faith.
He became what some people say is the leading Christian apologist of the second half of the 20th century. And other people say he became the author of the most important children's series of the 20th century. So you can't answer that just with one simple answer. He was a complex man.
All births are remarkable and equal. Still, occasionally, the forces of life, circumstance, and the wisdom within create uncommon men and women. Clive Staples Lewis, who published under the name C.S. Lewis and whom friends called Jack, was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, on November 29, 1898. He lived in a boyhood home called Little Lee, surrounded by his father, Albert, his mother, Flora, his brother, Warren, and shelves filled with classic literature and books of myth, fantasy, and adventure. with all that's been written about Lewis's childhood, two things stand out. First, he was a boy with great imagination. He and brother Warnie would play for hours in the attic at Little Lee with Lewis writing stories and drawing pictures. Second, he was deeply saddened and resentful at the loss of his mother. She died of abdominal cancer when Lewis was just 9 years old.
The great tragedy of his childhood was the loss of his mother when he was only a little boy. And that changed the whole pattern of his life. And his father's inability to cope with his own grief, again, had an enormous impact on Jack.
Throughout his adolescence, the creative, academic-minded Lewis rose through the ranks of prep school and found his way to Britain's acclaimed Oxford University. In the autobiographical book, Surprised by Joy, which Lewis wrote years later, he referred to himself at this age as an atheist.
When he was a child and his mother was dying of cancer, he prayed and asked God to heal her, and she, of course, died. And he believed at that time God either isn't there, or if he's there, he's just cruel. And so here was the problem of pain and the problem of evil coming into his life at an early age, and he saw God as either impotent to do anything about it or very cruel in the way he worked with things.
Lewis's faith in the existence of God was further challenged when he became a soldier during World War I.
What happens to a man when he goes into combat? What happens to him when his best friend is killed in combat? When men around him, men under his command, are killed?
Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry, Lewis arrived on the front lines in France on his 19th birthday. He was wounded in action less than a year later and returned to Oxford.
World War I has a profound impact on him, and it makes him wrestle with why he lives and so many of his comrades died. Why? What's going on here? Is there a purpose? Is this just random?
Among the casualties, Lewis lost his good friend, Irishman Paddy Moore. Lewis and Moore had made a pact before leaving for the front.
Paddy and Jack had agreed that if either one of them died and the other one survived, they would take care of their families. So when Paddy died, Jack was good to his word, and he took care of Mrs. Moore, and he took care of her daughter, Maureen.
Mrs. Moore. There's been a lot written, about Lewis's relationship with Mrs. Moore. Some say that early on, it was an infatuation and there was a sexual encounter, and then later, especially after Lewis became a Christian, that was cut off. The relationship changed.
I interviewed Maureen. I had a good conversation with her. She said she suspected that there was something going on in the early years. Her mother was a very attractive woman. She was about 40-ish when Jack was wounded. He came home from the war. He was half her age, but, stranger things happen.
So I think there was an evolution in his relationship with Mrs. Moore, and towards the end, she was probably not easy to get on with, and Lewis probably did suffer under that in terms of the impact on his own time in any given day, in any given moment. But I think to his credit, he didn't complain.
A few months after his father's death in 1929, Lewis purchased a home in Headington Quarry, about 3 miles from the Oxford campus. He set up house with Mrs. Moore and Maureen. Shortly after moving in, Lewis and the Moores were joined there by Lewis's brother, Warnie. A secluded 2-story near an area where clay bricks were fired, the Kilns was his home until his death. Though C.S. Lewis had a domestic life at the Kilns, he spent most of his time on the grounds of Oxford University, where he taught, wrote and lectured for nearly 30 years.
It's such a timeless place. There's a heaviness to it, a weight. On the positive side, it's a safe environment to escape into any book you want. There's no better place to read than Oxford. I think that Oxford works as an editor rather than as an expansive drug, you know, and so I think he was able in some interesting way to be less edited by it than some other writers.
I don't think Oxford was the kind of inspiration for him that you and I might feel it would be. I think he took it more for granted than any of us could. He loved the landscape of the Cotswolds, or the Lake Country, or of Northern Ireland, where he grew up. He loved the landscape. And his imagination was certainly nurtured by the beauty of the countryside on those walking tours. But for him, I think literature was the primary source of nurture for his imagination.
Lewis loved Oxford. He loved the spires. He loved the life in Oxford, and part of it is he loved the life of the mind. And Oxford is a wonderful place for those who love the life of the mind.
More than 30 colleges make up Oxford University. Throughout his tenure, Lewis taught at Magdalen College. He also kept rooms at Magdalen, where he tutored students and spent many late evenings in philosophical discussion with friends such as J.R.R. Tolkien, Owen Barfield, Neville Coghill, and Hugo Dyson.
It was inevitable, I think, that Tolkien and Lewis meet. It was not inevitable that they become friends, which they did. He liked friendship, conversation, good conversation with a pint of beer in a pub. He loved the atmosphere of pubs. And there was a great night light, you know, when, say, Tolkien would come to dine in Magdalen with Lewis, or Lewis might go to Pembroke to dine with Tolkien.
I would say, in terms of just sheer encouragement of one another, the idea that they found someone who liked the same things as the other person. There's this story is told that at a point they sort of agreed that nobody was writing the kind of books that they liked to read, so they decided that they would do it.
More than 50 years after the publication of Lewis's The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, theirs remains one of the world's great serendipitous friendships. Along with Tolkien, Lewis founded the Inklings, a small group of Oxford scholars who met weekly at the Eagle and the Child pub, or in Lewis's Magdalen College rooms. They drank, they socialized, and most important of all, they shared their philosophy and their work.
It was a normal practice at one of these informal meetings, either in a pub or in Jack's rooms, for whoever was working on something at the time to read passages of it aloud to the rest of the group and invite criticism. I'm not sure that I would have the courage to read my work aloud to people like John Wayne and C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and invite criticism, but they did. And I think that the process of honing their words with great minds of equal interest in literature is one of the things that characterizes the finished works of these men on such a high level.
early inklings were essential to Lewis socially, and the members all contributed to each other critically. But for Lewis, some members of the group were also important to his transformation from an atheist to a theist to a Christian.
From about the age of 10 until he was about 33, he had been assuming that Christianity was just another myth, a beautiful lie.
He was the most reluctant convert in the United Kingdom. He didn't really want to be a believer, but he couldn't help himself. He was drawn to God. God kept drawing him to him.
And then he read Chesterton's Everlasting Man, and at that point he began to see that maybe Christianity was not so intellectually in the dark as he had thought. And so there's this journey, but what he's doing at this point is he's really looking for reasons not to believe in the Christian faith, and yet without him even trying, things are coming into his life to force him to look at it and say, well, maybe it's not such a, open and shut case.
In one evening in October of 1931, Lewis invited Tolkien and another friend, Hugo Dyson, an English tutor, to dine with him in Magdalen College. It was raining outside, the wind was blowing. After dinner, they started talking about myth. Now, this is something Lewis had thought about a great deal, but by myth, he meant something false, not true. They discussed this all the way as they walked through this wind-blown Addison's Walk.
He always loved myth, but myth was not fact, and myth was, something that was false. And that's the same category he put Christianity in.
But as Tolkien pushed him, and Tolkien said, Jack, don't you understand that these older myths were glimpses that people had received of what was really going to happen?
They went into Lewis's rooms and hammered away at it till 4 in the morning. And at the end, Lewis believed, because what Tolkien and Hugo Dyson had showed him is that at one point, however, myth became fact.
Oh, and the light comes on for him. He said, I hadn't thought of it quite that way.
What he began to realize is that myth is not false. Myth participates in truth. And so you have all these different storylines, mythic storylines, and each reflect the truth.
He recognizes that myth is the truth that has survived. And the reason it survived is that it appeals to the human imagination. And indeed, the ancient myths of all cultures represented the human imagination's attempt to express their understanding of the relationship between human beings and divine power. And of course, that's the reason that there's so many similarities in the myths of so many different cultures.
All of these come out of this common origin, but what happens with Christianity is Christianity is the true myth. It holds on to everything that's true, and it actually becomes historical fact. And that is that this dying God that all these other talk about actually happens in Christianity. You can date it.
The transformation of C.S. Lewis from atheist to Christian became the most significant event in his life. While he continued his work as a scholar in medieval literature, he also began a career as a Christian writer and novelist. The Screwtape Letters, That Hideous Strength, Till We Have Faces, The Great Divorce, The Chronicles of Narnia. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Lewis's popular fiction made him a household name in England and the United States, where many of his books sold to both Christian and non-Christian readers.
He's known as a Christian writer in Christian circles, But many people read him and don't know that he's a Christian writer. He doesn't look like a Christian writer dressed up to be a children's writer, you know, trying to get a point across about Christianity. He actually is a bona fide children's writer and actually has written myth and attractive fiction.
Lewis had the ability to touch universal human experience. And I think the Chronicles of Narnia characterize that. You see that. So I think whether one has Christian persuasions or does not have Christian persuasions, the book speaks. The book, you can come and maybe not have any idea that there's anything Christian about them at all, but come away touched, come away enriched as a human being for having traveled through those stories.
I think Lewis was aware that you'll lose people's attention and you'll turn some people off by bringing in Christianity. And so many of these things, like the Narnian stories, are not overtly Christian at all.
The most popular of Lewis's fictional works is the children's book series called The Chronicles of Narnia. Like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Narnia takes us into a world of myth and imagination with an underlying message that some people believe parallels the story of Christ.
He appealed to our sense of right and wrong. Now, we may not accept the Christian conception of right and wrong, but he can bring that over into this parallel world where we don't have prejudices. And we cheer. Tolkien did the same thing. Tolkien says he basically takes, this world and he sort of plays it out in this parallel world of Middle-earth, and we're all on board, and we're all cheering for the right things, and awakens these things within us. And I think that's what Lewis is doing as well, and he did it intentionally.
I think Lewis and Tolkien were effectively in competition, but I think it was rather more from Tolkien's side. Certainly, when he read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, he thought it was awful stuff. He said Lewis should never have put all those things in there, such as nymphs and satyrs and Father Christmas, and it was mixing mythology in the most preposterous way. But they're very different writers. Lewis was not fundamentally concerned with the past in the way that Tolkien was.
And yet there is a commonality between them, which is the shared depth of understanding of language. If you build an arch, a Gothic arch, for example, every stone is an essential key part of that arch, and the arch simply won't work without it. Both the Lord of the Rings and the Narnian Chronicles are built in that way.
In the first book Lewis wrote in the Chronicles of Narnia series, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, 4 siblings climb through a wardrobe in the house of old Professor Kirk and find themselves in the mythical land of Narnia. They encounter an evil witch and a powerful but loving lion named Aslan.
Universe on its own. It has its own little countries round about it, Archenland and Calaman and so on. It's quite separate from ours. Lewis operates in his narratives by a process of what one might call displacement. So what assumptions you make about something are continually being undercut.
I suppose they would fall into the genre of fairy tales in one sense. The timeline of Narnia bears no relationship with the timeline of our world at all. And children from our world keep going to Narnia and coming back and having fantastic and fascinating adventures with all sorts of interesting characters, fauns and centaurs, and the animals of Narnia are gifted with speech and thought.
Well, I think that Lewis had a way of showing that what we take for granted is extraordinary, and the extraordinariness is realised in Narnia. But he has a sense of ceremony and hierarchy as being part of the everlasting nature of the world, that everyone finds oneself in one's proper place, even though one may meet across them. And so that's part of it. He writes hierarchically in style because that's the cast of his mind.
Lewis saw life in epic proportions, and we don't. That we're engaged in something much bigger than ourselves. And the issues are real, and people are real, and the world in which we live in was created by a personal God who was incredibly creative, and this world is enchanted.
There's tension, there's intrigue, there's battles for good and evil there, and the kinds of things that we're really caught up in this world. There is a struggle for good and evil. There's people, human beings are having to make difficult choices, and when they do, they have consequences. And it's put in a context that even children can understand, but adults are enthralled.
What's important is the principle of joy versus the principle of abnegation, if we can even dignify it with the word principle. The current of innocence versus the poison of defamation and desecration.
A lot of people think that the Narnian Chronicles are allegories, but they're not, because there's not an exact one-to-one relationship. You know, Aslan is a Christ-like figure, but he's not exactly like Christ. The witch is like the evil one, but not exactly.
The wardrobe in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is a symbol of enclosure, and the children coming out of it into a new country is in a sense, it is a way of going into the soul, actually, because I think Narnia is the landscape of the spirit to some degree, but it is certainly a way of going out of the self.
This is what Lewis called a supposal. Suppose there were a world like Narnia. Suppose it had animals in it. Suppose God wanted to redeem that world like he has ours. Then suppose he had his son become a lion, as he did in this world, but becoming a man. You are with Aslan, you hear him, you have adventures, the children ride on his back, and yet you might be with him and taking it all in, and only later, long after you read the books, do you realize, I've met that same character in the real world, and where we call him Jesus.
Like the Chronicles of Narnia, all of C.S. Lewis's books have been in print for close to 50 years. Sales of Narnia have been increasing, with more than 1 million copies now sold annually. And his non-fiction Christian writings are not only popular, they seem to appeal to Christians from all denominations.
I think the basis of his widespread popularity is that his Christian faith was, as he called it, mere Christianity. It was basic Christianity. It was Christianity that created a unifying element. And so Roman Catholics and Baptists and many others find there a reinforcement.
What do you do with a world full of people who say Jesus was a great teacher, yet they're saying he's not who he said he was? He's a great teacher, but he's not God. And Lewis says, well, how can he be a great man and a great teacher? A wonderful man, a wonderful prophet, but yet not who he says he is. He's either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's who he says he is.
And what he could do for the brethren, all the brethren, Catholics, non-Catholics, Baptists, whatever, is to say, look, we've got so much in common. I'm not going to talk about your differences. I don't want you to think about your differences. Just while you're reading this book or listening to this talk, think about what you have in common.
Pagan and Christian ages alike are ages of what Pausanias would call the dromenon, the externalized, enacted idea.
At the height of World War II, Lewis often spoke to the people of Great Britain over BBC radio. Several of his talks, including What Christians Believe, Christian Behavior, and Beyond the Personality, were eventually put into one non-fiction book and published under the title Mere Christianity. Like many of Lewis's writings, the concept was simple, inclusive, and unifying. He wrote,
"We are told that Christ was killed for us, that his death has washed out our sins, and that by dying he disabled death itself. That is the formula. That is Christianity. That is what has to be believed."
I think it appeals to a certain type of person. Lewis is writing a book in an age when naturalism or materialism, philosophically speaking, is the reigning mindset, the reigning spirit of the times, and so he's trying to take things on in a very logical fashion and explain why. Here's basic Christianity. Here's what it really looks like.
In the illustration, in fact, he uses in the book is the idea of a hallway with many doors. And the hallway, which is common to all the doors, all the rooms, is mere Christianity. And then out of that hallway, you have different doors. And so if the hallway is mere Christianity or Christendom, there's a door that goes into the Catholic Church, and probably within that door you have some other doors of different sort of schools of thought within the Roman Catholicism. There's a Protestant door for Presbyterians and Baptists and things like that. But we all have in common this hallway.
It cuts through all of the denominational rubbish, all the dross that we have added to what Christ did and what Christ taught. Cuts through right to the nitty-gritty of the matter and makes it so very simple for people to understand what Jesus was really all about.
Lewis is saying that there's a common theological, doctrinal tradition that runs through all the major Christian, not denominations, traditions, the Greek the Orthodox tradition, the Roman Catholic tradition, and the Protestant tradition. They all hold to a Trinitarian conception of God. They all hold to the Son of God becoming incarnate, in a particular point in history, and being incarnate for the purpose of our salvation, and that is for dealing with our sins.
Lewis was able to convey his Christian message with simplicity and with humor. Among his most popular books is the satirical portrait of a devil and his apprentice in the Screwtape Letters.
The way in for me is humor, and that did it for me. And if you've ever heard John Cleese read it, that's also a treat because he did it on tape. But it's just such an appealing way to look at that little devil that speaks in all of our ears.
My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend.
Screwtape Letters is the book that really put Lewis on the map, as it were, in terms of public profile.
Himself to be converted.
And especially that it was written by an Oxford Don, talking about the devil and temptation, and writing as if he's taking these things seriously.
Mine, as long as you can, your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
That, at that period of time when it came out, was just unheard of. People didn't believe in that sort of thing anymore.
He wanted to do something that would engage people, that would engage their imaginations as well as their minds. So he settled on this technique of these letters, where this senior demon writes to his nephew, a junior demon, and they discuss how they're going to tempt people who belong to the enemy. In other words, those who follow God, disciples of Christ. And that's the way the thing is set up. But one of his purposes is for people to understand the battle that's going on in their own souls and in the world around them, the struggle between good and evil, to understand what the stakes are and how deep these are.
The Screwtape Letters, of course, is brilliant satire. And I sometimes feel that there was an unfortunate dichotomy in Lewis, that the cast of his mind made him best at satire, that that's really his greatest gift. But that was not the kind of reading that he liked best. He liked reading medieval romances. He liked reading fantasy. And so he tried to write the sort of book he liked best to read. But I don't think any of that work is as good as the satire.
Despite the distraction of Mrs. Moore, of his alcoholic brother Warney, and of teaching at one of the world's leading universities, C.S. Lewis managed to be prolific. He often walked through the English countryside near Oxford and to the pond near his house. Inspiration never seemed to leave him far behind.
As far as inspiration is concerned, most of his books, he says, simply came to him through mental pictures and visual things. Like the line "The Witch in the Wardrobe" started with this, with a faun in a snowy wood with an umbrella. Then later Aslan came into it. But he said, I never exactly made a book. You know, I was rather like taking dictation. I was given things to say.
And as I've said before, and will probably say many times again, while Jack was the writer of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the Holy Spirit of God was its author.
I think he had a sense in which, you know, the fiction wasn't written by him, it was written by something else. He was given these things, he was given the images, he was given the lion, which came jumping into his dreams, actually his nightmares in 1947 or thereabouts.
The other thing is that I think Lewis believed that his experience was not something unique, but much of it was common to the ordinary individual. So that, you know, when he takes a walk and there's that moment where all of a sudden the wind whips up and it's an autumn day and that poignant smell of autumnness comes to you and the leaves blow in a certain way and you kind of go, you know, he says, well, I'm not the only one that's experienced that.
Through most of his adult life, Lewis was defined by his writing, his teaching, and his friendship with the Inklings. Yet, despite his lengthy and acclaimed tenure at Oxford, he was repeatedly denied a professorship.
I think clearly from what I've been able to read and understand, his popularity on sort of a lay level, his willingness to write outside the academic community, to write for the common person, and especially to write theology, to write Christianity, and to do it so boldly, and actually to attack his colleagues' positions, didn't make him popular.
The truth is, Lewis was a first-rate scholar, and like the volume he wrote in the Oxford History of English Literature series, it is still the standard work on that century, on English literature in the 16th century. It's still the standard work.
His overt faith? Jealousy of his popular success? Perhaps. No one knows for sure. But for Lewis, being denied a professorship by his alma mater was a painful sidebar to an otherwise illustrious career. It was Cambridge University that offered Lewis what he'd always wanted, the chair of medieval and Renaissance English literature.
There's a wonderful letter of Tolkien to Lewis encouraging him to accept this professorship at Cambridge and giving him reasons how he could do it, and it convinced Lewis. Once he does get to Cambridge, he did like Cambridge. He liked the atmosphere, he liked Magdalen College.
From 1955 through to 1963, Lewis split his time between an academic life at Cambridge and his home life at the Kilns in Oxford. By this time, he'd become a renowned figure in both England and America. He was besieged by correspondence, yet, with the help of his brother Warney, he responded to nearly every one. It was through his correspondence that Lewis began an encounter that not only changed his life, it crystallized his emotional and spiritual core.
Anybody here called Lewis?
On the afternoon of September 24th, 1952, at Oxford's Eastgate Hotel, Clive Staples Lewis met Joy Davidman Gresham for afternoon tea.
A pleasure.
This is my brother, Warney.
Major Lewis.
Please sit down.
For Joy, the meeting was the culmination of a long journey of self-discovery.
It's just that you don't look at all like C.S. Lewis.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, not to mention the rest of Oxford.
And there she is in South Fallsburg, New York, with 2 boys and a terrible marriage and an alcoholic husband and a yearning. And she starts reading these books and she feels a connection.
Joy, like many people who lived in the 20th century, was searching for something. And in her search, she encountered C.S. Lewis, the writings of C.S. Lewis. Lewis's writings led her to the New Testament. The New Testament pointed her to Jesus Christ, and she became a Christian.
She began writing to Lewis in 1950, and he enjoyed the correspondences. He had a lot of letters to write, but these he really did enjoy. I mean, he didn't just enjoy writing to her, he enjoyed her letters.
Because of her education and her intellectual abilities, her letters were different. Her letters were revealments of this amazingly powerful mind. A mind seeking truth, which was something Jack deeply respected, the search for truth. At the time she was growing up, it became evident to her that you either became a Nazi and conquered the world, or you became a communist and saved it. And so she searched for that kind of a philosophical truth.
And she was born Jewish to a lefty, sort of socialist, communist background. I know a little bit about that. I think she was confused because she had spiritual yearnings that, ironically, usually we find children brought up in households that are too strong religiously, and so they have to break out, and then they find it later. In her case, she had a yearning, and there was nothing there. It was very political.
And so, having written to Jack and having established this pen friendship, this correspondence back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, she was determined to try to meet the man. And she did, in fact, in 1952, and they became friends.
The meeting at the Eastgate Hotel led to friendship, to marriage, and eventually to love.
People were frightened of him often, but Joy wasn't, and it was sort of like an intellectual tennis match, and she could knock that ball back across the court to him just as fast as he could at her, and he loved it. But he also was attracted to her just as a woman, as a friend.
When my mother and my father finally split up completely, my mother fled from America to England, where at the time it was cheaper to live. She was struggling financially very hard. He helped her through a lot of difficult times. And I think that was the beginning of their emotional relationship.
In late 1955, the British government refused Joy permission to live and work in England. Lewis responded by asking Joy to marry him in a civil ceremony, a marriage that extended his citizenship to Joy and her sons.
They got married before they fell in love and proceeded to fall in love afterwards. And I think that the unfolding of this relationship was really based in Jack's charity and friendship.
Lewis went through this register marriage not because he was romantically in love, but simply because he was a good man and he wanted to spare her having to go back.
Though they were often companions, Lewis and Joy did not at first live together. Still, the relationship began to change Lewis.
In the obvious sort of cliche way, she opened him up, opened his heart. I mean, he was in his head, he was an intellectual, he was fun-loving, but it was in a sort of repressed way. And I think she opened him up in the way that true love opens anyone.
Within just months of their legal marriage, Joy was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Doctors gave her just weeks to live. During that time, Lewis invited an Anglican priest named Peter Bide to visit Joy in the hospital.
While they're talking, and this is what Bide told me, Jack said to him, "You know, the one thing I wish Joy could have is her dying wish is that our marriage could be recognized by the church. She'd love to be married in the church." So the next morning in the hospital, with a nurse as an attendant and with Warren Lewis there with Jack, Father Bide consecrated the marriage.
Joy and her sons moved into the Kilns, and Lewis became her caretaker.
She had been sent home to die. She was thought at the time to be only likely to live a few days, maybe a matter of hours. But there was one moment in their experience together at that point when he was looking after her, when she suddenly realized that she had fallen head over heels in love with him. I think he'd already fallen and realized his love for her when she was in the hospital, before she was sent home to die.
What happened next would for many be considered a miracle.
You can write it off as well as just typical remission, but according to her physician, she was way past that. But she did go into a remission. It lasted for several years. They had a very normal and joyous marriage. They traveled to Ireland together. They traveled to Greece. They had a great time.
Despite the many accounts of their apparently loving marriage and life at the Kilns, there are scholars who question whether their marriage was ever consummated. Many others consider the debate irrelevant. It is known with certainty that Lewis was rarely far from Joy's side during her final years. Among the highlights of their time together was a trip to Greece, where Lewis was able to visit the mythical world he'd read about since his childhood. During the spring of 1960, Joy's cancer returned. On July 13th, 45-year-old Joy Davidman died. Her body was cremated 4 days later. Overcome with sorrow, Lewis penned an argument with God in what many consider one of the greatest essays ever written about death, A Grief Observed.
Here is probably his most intimate relationship of his life, and so now he's processing it in terms of as a Christian, and therefore what his grief does, it's like hitting back, as he says, striking out. And so what becomes the object of that striking out? Well, it's his faith.
It's a tiny little book, but it is a completely honest look at grief and what it was doing to him. And for a while there, his faith in God, not his faith in the existence of God, but his faith in the nature of the God, of God was sorely tempted, sorely tested.
What he realized is that grief is not a state, but it's more like a history. It has an ongoing life, and there are phases in that grief.
He trusts God because he knows his character. And Lewis can say in a grief observed, sometimes my prayer life is like pounding on a door that's bolted shut from the other side. But he doesn't doubt that God is on the other side. He doesn't understand why he's not hearing anything back at the moment. Why the connectedness isn't there that he wants. Faith is absolutely essential.
After Joy's death, Lewis's health began a decline. He continued his work at Cambridge, and he did his best to father Joy's two sons, David and Douglas. But he was also suffering from infected kidneys, an enlarged prostate gland, and a weak heart.
22nd of November 1963, I was teaching at the University of Kentucky, and on the way or coming from a class, I ran into a colleague who told me the unbelievable news that President Kennedy had been shot and might be dying. Anyway, during the day, of course, we heard the dreadful news that he did die. When I finally got to my bed that night, a very, very tired and sad man, just about to fall asleep when Douglas Gresham rang me and said, "I'm so sorry to have to tell you, but Jack died today." Turns out he died the same hour that President Kennedy was killed.
Children's literature, scholarly works, adult fantasy and science fiction, Christian apologetic essays. Considered by many the greatest Christian writer in the English language, C.S. Lewis is buried in the graveyard at Trinity Church, the local parish he visited nearly every Sunday of his adult life. He shares a grave with his brother, Warney. And the modest, unkempt grave of Mrs. Moore is about 30 feet away.
I consider Lewis's greatest legacy being that the 30-some books he wrote in many genres, all the writing he did, that many, many lives during his lifetime and continuing to this day have been utterly changed because of what he did. People, broken people, wounded people, people bound up in all kinds of things they wanted to be free from, have found freedom through Jesus Christ that Lewis's books pointed to. I certainly was one of those, and I am not unique.
He knew what his apostolate was, and he did it. You know, you might know what you were supposed to do in the world, and you might not do it. But Lewis knew, and at great difficulty to himself, he did it.
If there's a legacy in terms of his Christianity, then that legacy is that he made it as plausible as about anybody did in the 20th century. You may not at the end of the day agree with him, but Christianity is no longer this sort of mindless believism, but there's a reason for accepting these things, and you just can't write it off. And those who do, I think, have not really listened to him.
Well, in other writers you've been reading, you get a corner of the curtain is raised, you get a little bit of the truth. With Lewis, the big curtains just open up wide, they extend all the way to the side of the theater, and you see everything that's in front of you. You see more than you've ever seen before. To see through Lewis's eyes is to see the universe almost as I think God sees it.
It's very easy to get fascinated by Jack's development as a human being, or to get fascinated by the development of his literature. But all the time, no matter what the subjective angle of one's own interests are, we should look beyond that to the power of the Holy Spirit of God behind it, governing it. channeling it, guiding Jack all the time. That's what's really important. Jack himself is much less important.